This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, cultural workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with LaTaSha Levy, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Howard University. Her research focuses on the fraught place of Black conservatism in the history of African-American political life and dissent. She is also the founder of Black Star Rising, a Black Studies curricula and consulting enterprise focused on expanding access to Black studies beyond the ivory tower. In this conversation, we discuss the singular contributions of the field of Black studies, its internal debates and conflicts, and how Black studies remains a centerpiece for understanding liberation struggle in a time of deep political crisis. Good morning, TaSha. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good, John. How are you?
Not too bad. We're recording this on a snow day, so
Yes.
rather than hurrying off from this conversation off to have lunch and then hurrying off to teach, I will go back and sit on my couch after this. So,
I love it.
yes, very rare in the DMV that we get these kinds of snow days. So absolutely going to try to enjoy it.
Yes. I told my husband we need to go out there and play in the snow. So we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. We came from Seattle, and so it's been hard to adjust to the temperature, but the snow has been beautiful. So haven't seen it in so long.
I might try to get my 13-year-old out there in a little snowball fight, get a little dad's revenge on him being home for so many days in a row here with these snow days. But anyway, I'm really glad that you made time for this, and also, welcome back to the DMV. It's really exciting. You're down the road at Howard, and so I'm sure off podcast we'll have time over the years to come to collaborate on stuff. And, there's lots of reasons why I'm excited that you made time for this podcast, right? To sort of hear about your research, your thoughts on the field. But also, I know I speak for Ashley Newby, my collaborator as well. It's just really nice on the Black Studies podcast to have people on who have PhDs in the field. It's just a really different perspective. And so for that reason, I'm a little bit extra happy to have you on the series. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to join.
Let me start. We'll get into, of course, talking about how you see the field of Black studies, how you see your own research in relation to the field, and so on. But I really wanted to start off with maybe a more personal question, which is to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What's that journey like for you? What drew you to Black studies? And I always like to add to that, what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a question that I think has me in a moment of so just deep, deep gratitude to even be in a space where I can do Black studies. I started off as a kid. I mean, this is really deep into my upbringing in terms of community spaces. So for me, I was raised in Black studies in the community outside of the Ivory Tower. And this happened just in terms of growing up in Washington, D.C., in Southeast. And, I attended a elementary school. Well, really, there were no white people around. So I grew up in D.C. when it was truly Chocolate City. White people were in Georgetown, they were downtown, but we never saw them anywhere else. So, I only had Black teachers. We only had Black principals in the school. And so part of what I remember, and I don't remember what grade, but as soon as I started reading, one of the teachers identified me as someone who should read the morning announcements on the, you go into a room on the intercom. And I remember that whole
position, actually.
Exactly. So I remember they called me to the office and they said, "Why don't you read these lines?" And they introduced me to reading over the intercom. And the thing that I would read over the intercom was Black history facts. And so, truly second grade, maybe. I was reading Black History Facts over the intercom, and so that was something that piqued my interest, or it was just kind of embedded that we're going to start the day off, thinking about how brilliant we are and what contributions we are. And even though I don't recall people talking about it as being Black history, it was just the thing that we did in the morning because we were all Black in that space. But it did provide a strong foundation in terms of how we saw ourselves as people of African descent. And that really stayed with me. As I got older, just being in this particular school where we were all poor, and working class, and moving to Alexandria, Virginia, where I was bused from a diverse working class neighborhood to a school where I was only like, one out of maybe 5 Black kids in the whole 6th grade. And that was so jarring and traumatic for me, in that I started to think about all of the ways that the culture around me outside of school is infused with white supremacist ideas, And so before I even started the 6th grade in Alexandria, Virginia, and Northern Virginia, which has one of the, has a reputation of having one of the best school districts in the country, I was told by my Black teachers in Southeast DC that I wasn't going to be as smart as the white kids in Virginia, that I needed to spend time that summer studying before I go, because I'm not going to probably be as advanced as them, even though I was in the gifted and talented program at my elementary school in DC. So I had all this anxiety about going to school with white kids. And when I got in that classroom, and I say it didn't take that long, maybe a couple of weeks, couple of months, I was furious. I was pissed because I was still smarter than most of those kids. I felt like they were bad as hell. They were doing things we weren't doing as the Black kids as 6th graders. But there was this narrative around what it means to be a Black kid from DC, from Southeast. That was very negative, that the expectations were so low for us, even in a space that was very nurturing for us, having the idea that, oh, you're not going to be able to compete with these white kids. And so I was very vocal about thinking about what made us think that I couldn't compete. I started thinking about the things that I watch on television, images around whiteness and Blackness, thinking about how there was so much ingenuity, love, nurturing that was happening in my community in Southeast that did not radiate, on television, when you think about who lives in Southeast and who comes out of Southeast DC. And I became very in tune about these narratives and these ideologies that are also, just promoted narratives of anti-Blackness. And I was pissed off. And so I started to question my teacher all the time. So I asked her, okay, it's been like 3 months and we haven't learned anything about a Black person. Are you going to teach us anything about Black people? I started to, once we did Western civilization, it was like, is there anything about Eastern civilizations that we could learn about? And so I would always challenge her. And she ended up pulling me to the side. And she had a tenderness about her, white woman, that I would never forget, that reminded me of my teachers in Southeast. So she wasn't turned off or felt disrespected by me raising these questions. But she told me that she valued that I would raise these questions with her, and thanked me for raising them. She said that she was going to recommend me for the AP. I don't know if it was called AP or Gifted and Talented track. And so then I thought about the fact that the other Black kids, the few of us who were bused to this school, were just as smart as me, if not smarter. So then I was pissed off about tracking. So I was like, okay, so the only reason why I'm going to get on the Gifted and Talented track is because I was vocal. Like they didn't say anything, or they were class clowns, but they were brilliant kids. They were far more smarter than me, that some of them I thought. And that angered me. So then I got in a tracking system that separated me from Black kids in the school, from middle school and high school, where they could easily be like 30% or more of the population, but I'm 1 out of 3 in AP courses. And my friends who were not in AP were brilliant, were smart. They could have done this work. And the AP track prepared us for college, whereas the other tracks did not. And I'm like, all of my friends who are not in AP can go to college. They can learn how to write a thesis statement. They can learn how to write a paper, but they're not doing that in their courses. And so I was mad. And even in that first time I entered into an integrated setting in Virginia, I started reading on my own. I remember I started reading a book about Harriet Tubman in the 6th grade. And so I was committed to re-educating myself. And since I was in Virginia and I would take trips, start riding the train, and I think about how young I was, 7th, 8th grade, I would get on the train by myself to go back to DC. And I would stop at the brothers are selling, books outside of the train station, and I would get some black soap and look at the books and buy one if I had money here and there. And so that was a part of cultivating a consciousness. At the time when we talk about what it meant to be conscious, people might say woke now, which is a different variation of that, and that's been co-opted. But for us, it was really important to be conscious. I think hip hop also contributed a great deal to raising the level of consciousness, whether that was X-Clan or Public Enemy, even Queen Latifah at that time. And so I felt like it was a moment of me being introduced to Black studies in ways that had nothing to do with the Ivory Tower. So by the time I was in middle school, a teacher had recommended me for a Saturday academy, who she wasn't even my teacher, but she was a Black woman in the school. So the Black kids would just go by and say, "Hey, Miss Richardson, and how you doing?" Because she was maybe one out of only two Black teachers in the school. And so she got to know me from me just walking by her class and saying hello to her. And she recommended me for a Saturday academy called Know Your History. And it was sponsored by Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. They usually have a community program called Guide Right, but in Alexandria, that Guide Right was reoriented for Afrocentric education. And so I had the unique experience of being able to do community Black studies every other Saturday, starting at about 13 years old. And that, again, fueled a lot of my rage and discontent. Like, why aren't we learning these things in the classroom? Why do I have to spend all this time identifying books for myself, or to spend my Saturdays to go somewhere else, which I really enjoy doing, but it really bothered me that, and I was very, again, vocal about it with my friends and my teachers. And it's funny because my friends, I was always a cool kid, I would think, but it was never, I hear these stories about, well, if you do well in school, you're Black, in Black social spaces among kids, they say you're trying to act white. And that was never the case. They always respected me for my intellect, or I was one of their smart friends, and they definitely respected that I was what was considered pro-Black or blackity Black, to the point of like teasing me, "Oh, you're like, Marcus Malcolm or something like that. Here come, we can't say this around TaSha." And so it was very much in a part of my upbringing as a child, Black studies outside the Ivory Tower that we don't even really talk about or discuss. But Know Your History was life-changing. I was in that program for 13 to 18 years old until I went to college. And I tried to replicate that everywhere I've gone. So I've, tried to do Saturday programs at other places, or encourage people to do something similar, to say we don't have to, depend on, we can't leave it up to our schools to teach us this. And part of what we learned in Black studies and community is that you do have to re-educate yourself, that you have the capacity to empower yourself through African-centered education. And think about someone like John Henry Clark. He was self-taught. Like, a lot of these people were brilliant and were self-taught. And what I also learned from being immersed in Black studies and community is that and we have studies that prove it now, is that our young people, if they have a strong foundation in culturally relevant education or something like African-American studies, they do well in their other subjects. So it empowers you to say, like, I'm gonna know my stuff and I'm gonna know your stuff, so I wanted to know everything about Western civilization so that I could critique it. And so it wasn't that, you go into Black studies and you just only study Black people or Black stories. you use it to critique or even it not always to critique. It could be an invitation to just think about the diversity of the human experience. And so that was really my introduction to Black studies. So nobody growing up with me no one's surprised that I ended up becoming a associate professor of African American studies. That was definitely my path. In terms of going to college, like I was at Hampton, they didn't have Black studies. We had a couple of classes. We did have the benefit of a remarkable mentor, Alec Kalan, who was foundational in those early debates around Black studies. He was a professor there. So I stopped the president, Harvey, at the time, like, President Harvey, can I ask you a question? Why don't we have Black studies here at Hampton University? And part of what I remember him telling me is that white schools need Black studies. Black schools don't, HBCUs don't need Black studies. And I was like, really? That's what you think? That's what you think?
Mm.
And the battle for me being at Hampton, and while I could take certain classes with amazing professors like Dr. Kalan, we had to do a humanities requirement. And the humanities requirement was only ancient Greece and Rome. And so I met with the chair of the English department. How is it that we're studying the humanities and you're telling me that African people have nothing to contribute to our understanding of humanities? And she, a West African woman, maybe from Cote d'Ivoire, I remember she told me, like, our foundation in America stems from Western civilization. This is our foundation. And it was more so a conversation about assimilation. And she was very much irritated by me having the audacity to even bring this to her attention. And so being at a HBCU, that was triggering to think that this would be a space that would embrace Black studies, but then say not only is it not needed here because for whatever, I don't know what his assumptions are around that we're all Black, but it didn't mean anything to them in terms of recognizing that the curriculum was Eurocentric and therefore inadequate and less rigorous, not to include not only African folks, the start of it all, but anything that was from the East. I was really horrified by. I transferred, I'm sorry, this is a long story. I transferred to the University of Virginia. And I didn't know that I would actually leave Hampton, but my godparents were like, maybe you would like it at UVA and you could probably get more financial support. And I didn't want to have anything to do with Thomas Jefferson's University. Okay. It's like, I'm not going to Thomas Jefferson's plantation, but sure, you want to take me on a tour there, I'll go. And once I saw that there was a Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies, like this was a sign outside the building. I keep walking. The next building down yonder says W.E.B. Du Bois Center. There was the Office of African American Affairs, and seeing Carter G. Woodson and Du Bois, their names on a marker on a university, I'm like, oh, bet this is it. I could definitely come here and feel comfortable. And so I ultimately majored in African American and African Studies at the Carter G. Woodson Institute. And then I returned to UVA to work in the Office of African American Affairs. I worked in student affairs before going to graduate school. I was the director of the Luther P. Jackson Black Cultural Center. And so even with that job, right after undergrad, I felt like I was doing my dream job. I was fulfilling my purpose. This has always been in me, but because I didn't have a graduate degree, it limited my earning potential. So I learned, being the director of the Culture Center on the university campus, I didn't have even a master's. And so it just made sense for me to get my graduate degrees in African American Studies. And so that's how I ended up in Black Studies. But it was really, my introduction is Black Studies in the community outside of the Ivory Tower.
So I say it almost every time in these conversations. This is my favorite part of every podcast. I just think people's journey into the field and into Black study, right? And, as you said, broadly thought, not just in the Ivory Tower, not just in offices and classrooms, is so essential. I cannot tell you how much I love that the real root here is reading Black facts at morning announcement in grade school. I mean, there's something like beautiful about that, and that's every principal's dream, I'm sure. when they design things like that, that maybe this will be the seed that makes these kinds of things possible. So I'm not a principal, never have been, never been a grade school teacher, but I feel moved by that. That's exactly why, how far can we throw seeds around this stuff is so important, because you never know. The morning announcement, I'm just thinking past podcasts, even Nathaniel Norman talking about, there used to be these little cards that came with 12 packs of Budweiser when he was young that had like African kings and queens, and that got him fascinated. It's like, you never know these things that capture fascination, and how fascination, especially for young people, so quickly turns into conviction, the way that turned into conviction for you. And there's a little bit of a sort of rewrite of Du Bois' introductory paragraphs to Souls of Black Folk there, right? About all of a sudden I saw my whole classmates in my class in a different way. And then that commitment to being the best.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I loved also that you came back to, being the smart kid, and you can't say that around TaSha. These are important parts of the story, right? It's like, because that hangs on everybody's conscience and respect and all of that. All that to say, that's a fantastic story. I guess I can figure out which side you'll fall on, given your experience at Hampton. But I was wondering what you thought was the real HU, but
oh, I know I could write a book about the Hampton experience. That's why it made me a good fit too to come to Howard. But I was thinking that Hampton would be the Howard away from home. If you're going to college, it's like, I do want to get the experience of going somewhere. And I thought that Hampton and Howard were basically Hillman College, because I'm first generation, so my family, I didn't go, none of them. My mother was very about education. She became concerned about my interests as very young, sixth grade in race and thinking about racism, because it wasn't just an interest like I want to be taught more about Black people. I was trying to figure out what's going on around us that would make us think that a Black kid wouldn't excel, or that Black children aren't already don't have the capacity to excel. And so I was mad about tracking in those days. And so I remember her telling me, you keep thinking that you are African, but African people don't like Black people. And I remember her saying, I was so angry. I was probably about 7th grade. And I was reading Malcolm X on my own, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And so it's funny, because I think she passed away when I was 18. But I think about that a lot now, that she was also, I just thought she was ignorant. She didn't know much herself, But there was a hard truth in that I'm now grappling with, especially being on the West Coast, where a large portion of the Black student population are African. And so much of what I had to do in my teaching was to combat some of the anti-Blackness that they have internalized, and thinking that, Black people don't have a culture. That was the one thing they kept saying, that their parents don't want them to identify as Black or to identify with Black people when they're, culturally are being brought up here. So even with my mother, I think about that a lot now in terms of what she was trying to communicate to me.
Yeah. Those are some of the most difficult and painful conversations in classes of mine. I have a couple of classes where this question of anti-African Americanness being a variation or exception to, or some version somehow connected to anti-Blackness, and the way that changes a Black studies classroom is kind of intense. I think when you talk about, I could write a book about that, about lots of things. That would be a major chapter. But yeah. And, in some ways it goes to the, what is Black studies and how is it related to all these different iterations of Blackness and anti-Blackness, right. Which, maybe then is a rough segue to just asking you how you imagine the field. As I was saying before, and you've articulated, your roots in Black studies just in terms of academic training and experience go all the way back. Right, to your undergrad, your undergrad, your graduate degree, and now you're teaching. So, this makes me especially interested to hear you talk about the portrait of the field you work with. How do you see the field of Black studies? And I specifically ask this in the context of its origin story, which is that demand by students in the late 1960s around the need to study the Black intellectual tradition, to study expressive culture, right? To talk about Black methodologies, the Black experience broadly, which disciplines hadn't covered, hadn't treated, and weren't going to treat. So Black studies was going to be that place to study. But of course, along with that, this was a moment of post-civil rights radicalization, a Black liberation struggle in which distinctions between study and activism, between campuses and communities had really collapsed, or at least was under pressure of collapse. And so Black studies also at its origin has that prescriptive dimension, that Black studies has to be a certain kind of commitment politically outside of its campuses. And although I don't know that we are still at that origin point in some ways, I also think that it carries with us today. I think that we still do talk about Black studies in relation to its origin and this founding tension. So in that context, I guess I'm saying, I'm interested to hear your portrait of Black studies and how it wrestles with, reconciles, or sides, or however you want to talk about it, with this founding tension.
I actually don't see that as a tension. And I'm thinking for those of us who have come through Black studies, as far as, being trained in it, even in our understandings of the origins, there's so many, even, there were many debates at that point, but it hasn't been in tension. Those things are entangled, they're related, they are interdependent. And so I don't see it as a tension at all. And I'm assuming, at least in terms of people I know and have worked with and collaborated with, there's no tension tension there in terms of it's not opposing paths. These things are interdependent. Our intellectual work is about our liberation. Our intellectual work is about understanding the human condition. What does it mean to be human? And that's where we, to me, the way I see Black studies, it is a reordering of knowledge. It is a challenge, or it's a way to see the world around us, to investigate, identify, critique, analyze, and to build a new world that is about social transformation, that's about justice and moving humanity forward. And so I do think, even though people might say this is about its origins, this idea that you have to be prescriptive or engaged in communities outside of the ivory tower, that is Black studies. I don't see how it could not be. Black studies can't just be the study of Black people. It never was, and it is not that now. And so even as I hear you framing it, which is a large part of the discipline, to say that it's about the study of Black life, that's a large part of it, but that's not the totality of Black studies. Black studies helps us to see the world. So Black studies helps us to examine and understand capitalism. Mm-hmm. It helps us to examine and understand democracy, institutions, power. That's Black studies. And so for me, you don't have Black studies without that imperative of social transformation. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're in other disciplines. You are history, your sociology, your political science, and that's fine. That's fine. Everybody don't have to be doing Black studies just because your subject matter is Black. And so for me, it has to have at its core a commitment to Black liberation. And the commitment to Black liberation is about moving humanity forward, not just Black people, And so that's very much a part of how I see it. I think when you, when you reduce it to say that it's about Black stuff or Black people and or Black life, then you miss so much of how we build a new world that's more just, and you miss a lot of the work that people are doing in Black studies. I think about this like when I went to Cornell. I taught a class on the Freedom Summer to high school students at Cornell through the Tell Your Ride program. This might have been 2019, and so I was excited to be on campus. I was hoping to hold the class in the Africana Studies and Research Center, but it was full. There was never any space all summer. I go over there, you would never know it's a Black Studies Institute. It's filled with math, chemistry courses. The only students in there are white students who are in the library. There's no space. I thought this was, how did this happen? And I look at the books as I'm going into the library. Guess whose book is on the top shelf, middle, front and center? Rachel Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal. Whatever book she wrote about being transracial, whatever, this white woman, her book was front and center at Africana Studies at Cornell. Then somebody intentionally put that there because why? Because she's talking about Black life? Because she's talking about race? Like, what makes her book, this woman who's not even an academic, what makes her book front and center in a space? Like, that is wild to me.
I'm a little dizzy from that. This is bizarre.
This is for real. This is for real. But if you don't define and be for real about what Black Studies is, then it's open to anything and everyone that's not doing the work of Black Studies. And I've seen in bookstores, for instance, the bookstores I've gone to, there have been several, and I've had my own little protest of always going to the Black Studies section. And recently, when Woke Racism came out by John McWhorter, Woke Racism, trash book, is in the Black Studies section. And I'm looking to someone, excuse me, can you go get your manager, please? I need to talk to them.
Seriously.
And I've done this at least 3 times. Let me explain something to you. Because a Black person writes a book does not mean they're in Black Studies. Because a book is about race, or even if it's about Black people, does not mean it's in Black Studies. You can put this book, Woke Racism, in essays and criticism. It can go somewhere else. And I'm telling you this because he's a person who has written against Black Studies.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's actively opposed Black Studies. So if it's about Black life and Black people, then it can be English, it can be anthropology, and that's fine. That's okay. But I really do think that Black Studies is a discipline that's committed to social transformation, knowledge for the sake of service, and our studies should be oriented towards those goals.
I love that. That was a really interesting reply. I mean, the thing about Dolezal on a bookshelf and John McWhorter in a bookstore, I mean, those things are a little dizzy making. I was curbed my appetite, I guess, for the rest of the day. So it'll be a low-calorie day for me.
Let me tell you.
That John McWhorter thing, I mean, look, I'm going to try to not get in, not take over the podcast, but it's been an issue on our own campus. But that was a really thoughtful answer. It's super interesting for a lot of reasons. And I thinking about the past podcasts, and I think you've actually carved out a really interesting and really precise way of thinking about Black studies in relation to all the kind of things that go along with that about politics, about intellectual traditions, about Black life, about Black study. I think that it's very different, not very different, but a really nuanced articulation there. So I really thank you for that. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. I can't wait till this gets out because I think a lot of people will be thinking about that. Because you put it really clearly and directly, and I think it pulls together so many things that are thought of, as you said, that are thought of as tensions, which really don't look at like tensions when framed the way you did. So I appreciate that. That was really nicely put. And let me ask you about your own work a little bit. I know you work with a mix of historical methods and questions of gender, political history, theory, and so forth. A real collage of Black studies elements. Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested how you see your own work related to the past of Black studies. Sort of how do you see it fitting in the field, but also how do you think it pushes boundaries and opens up new horizons?
Oh, that's a great question to think about. Because part of how I started studying Black conservatives, mentioning John McWhorter, is
By the way,
trying to
I don't know how you do it, so I just wanna announce my
exactly. This
respect
is
for this stuff.
this is part of what I'm saying. Like, yeah, we have to. We if we don't do it, who are we leaving it up to tell us what is going on here? Like, we have to do this work, and so I do take credit for reading the stuff that I don't want you all to have to read, and try to make
GoFundMe for
sense of it.
TaSha Levy, the mental health
Yes,
concerns. Yeah.
and that's real. That's real.
I'm
And
not
so
even
part of
joking.
it so let me try to explain too, like, as far as why I see that work is critical in Black studies is that my introduction to Black studies at Cornell, for instance, was that, we think about problems facing Black world communities. That's how you think about a research project. And so initially I thought, I would do something totally different. But I was thinking about what are some problems that we're facing in this moment. And after having served as the director of the Cultural Center at UVA, part of what was so central to my experience there was having to grapple with and fight ideological wars from the right. And so, there are students writing horrific assaults on Black students in the Cavalier Daily and the student newspaper. So every day you read the newspaper, in the op-ed section was a platform for people to attack Black students. Affirmative action was major, and UVA was targeted by anti-affirmative action organization. And so there were just all these constant assaults on Black people. But what does it mean when a Black person is espousing ideas that would be considered anti-Black and outright racist? So at that time, when I was dealing with trying to help students navigate right-wing ideology, I started a clipping file of Black conservatives. You remember clipping files, right? That's
Yeah.
a relic from the past, a throwback.
I forgot it was
I
a
had
relic,
a
yes.
clipping, yeah, I had a clipping file that I started of Black conservatives. So I was like, I got to try to think critically about this. Because it ain't just the white folks. The white right wingers ain't just the problem. The white liberals ain't just the problem. What is going on with these Black people who are being elevated in public space to say the thing that can't be said by a white person, basically? And so that clipping file made me think. I was like, okay, I've been traveling, and after a while, I regret that I got rid of the clipping file because of pressure, people telling me I have too much paper. And so I don't have it saved, but I started saving articles from these people. And so I decided that would be a problem space that I would investigate with a Black studies imperative. Like, this is a problem facing Black people, and Black conservatives are a problem. And it also was representative of broader interests for me. I've been drawn to conflicts, ideological struggle in Black liberation movements. And that's, a lot of times people steer away from conflict or they take sides, But that to me, and I think maybe because I grew up in Black spaces that, we debate, we fight, we argue, about ideas. And it's no hard feelings. This is not personal. We trying to get free. And so you were, getting to an argument or a debate was really about sharpening your position. And you have to be open to the fact that somebody has found a hole in your argument. Like, okay, I'm gonna have to rethink that. And unfortunately, I found that that's not how things actually work in academia. Not so nice, even though we claim to be a space. We don't do that. We don't do that very well. And so we were doing. The people at that I went through Cornell with, we all still really, really tight. And we had a space where we were constantly thinking about conflict and going directly to those debates. And so part of what I ended up centering by work around is conflicts around Black freedom struggles, particularly at around the time of the Black freedom movement, civil rights, and Black power. And so Black conservatism was one aspect of that. I was also interested in documenting the ways that Black women engaged in anti-imperialist struggles and, some of the ideological conflicts around that. And I think it was important for me to go to the conflicts in order for us to figure out how we're going to get free, how we're going to move forward. What can we discard, but what can we take away from this? And so I think that I see that as when connecting my work to the past, it seems like in the past, if you look at Abdullah Kalimat or James Turner, Robert Harris, all these people were getting involved in debates. They were having hard conversations. And part of what we learned at Cornell is that James Turner focused a lot on dialectics. And he actually moved us to be dialogical, and so even if you disagree with someone's position, it doesn't make them an enemy of Black people. You just try to work it out. You argue, you figure it out, and you come to a point of synthesis. Now, I found that as I started working on Black conservatives, it's not that, when I say people don't become your enemy, it's important for us to recognize that sometimes our enemies do look like us. So I'm not saying, we say all kinfolk ain't all skinfolk ain't kinfolk, and that's real. But for me, it was sort of like thinking about Malcolm X when he says, and we still struggle with this, just because we have different methods. As long as we have to share the same objectives, we shouldn't fall out with each other just because we have different methods, tactics and strategies or something like that. And I took that very seriously. But I found that a lot of people in academia, including in some Black study spaces, don't do that very well. But I initially was just trying to figure out how to deal with problems that we're facing. And now, oh my gosh. What's interesting, John, too, like I've been in Black study spaces where people ask the same, not the way you said it. You were just kind of like, I don't know how you do it. But people were kind of looking at me crazy, like, why are you in Black studies? Oh, that's what you study? How is that Black studies? And I've been treated, just kind of discarded by certain people, thinking that that's not a real Black studies project. And so the problem for me in terms of why I think it does push the boundary is that we have to do that work to name and to examine the world around us. We do it anyway, but we can do it systematically or do it in a scholarly fashion, because we do it anyway. But to me, like, we have to start talking about whiteness. We have to start talking about white pathologies. When Julian Bond wrote about the white problem in this country in the late 60s, what do we have to say about the white problem in this country? What is that? And I think where we are today is in full bloom in terms of how whiteness has undermined democracy, is undermining our institutions. And so that's how I feel like my work has a place in Black studies, and that's the kind of work that we have to continue to do, is to name and critique the world around us. And that comes out of Black nationalism too. So I'm thinking about, part of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture defining Black nationalism. I was really moved as a young person to see him in videos saying we need to move to define. Like, we get to define the world around us. I've gotten that from studying the Black arts movement, too. There was a lot of criticism of Western civilization, American civilization, American institutions. And so it's not just about the artist. The art has something to say about the world around us. And I think that's a part of what it means to be struggling for liberation, is to get into those areas that are uncomfortable or intense and to have these kind of debates.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was listening to you, I was thinking about the white problem, and then you mentioned it. So I was really happy to hear you turn to that, because it does strike me, because when I said, the emotional life of reading this material, I imagine, is actually quite difficult. Being playful about it, but it's really difficult. But there's, so much of Black studies, I think, is about that. I'm thinking about, a number of podcasts that we've had where historians of slavery have talked about, sort of emotional life of dealing with the slavery archive. So I think part of the emotional difficulty of Black studies has to have its own kind of voice. I mean, I think it's a real thing. But this particular work that you're talking about, and this is really just restating what you said, is important not only because it's part of the past, right? I even think, today's a snow day, so we're not doing it. But today we were going to be talking in my James Baldwin seminar about his debate with Buckley. And one of the questions I had for them is like, what do you think about the fact that Baldwin made so much space in his conversation and his intellectual life for this moment, right? And thinking of, anticipating all kinds of responses, but also asking that question, like, we don't really have this anymore.
Yeah.
And what does that leave us? And as I was listening to you talk, and I will cite you in my class. Now, it does make me think a little bit more sharply about it, because the way you were putting it in terms of Bond and the white problem, it's like we arrive at this point in 2025, and it's like we don't have a very robust vocabulary broadly. Mm-hmm. Some of us might, but most of us don't have a really sharp vocabulary for what is happening around white anxiety and white backlash and white assertions of complete and total authoritarian anti-democratic domination. Mm-hmm. But, when you're talking about, well, it's already there, right?
Yeah.
And what does it mean to have had it discarded as part of the tradition? It's not only a loss in terms of the sort of history that's important in American life or something like that. It is that. But also it's leaving us with so little vocabulary in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think in my work too, and in my teaching, I'm always pushing my students on that very point that we have to create new language to describe our, what's going on in our environments and what we want, that the language and concepts that we use are restrictive. And so I think that's also been a real benefit and a rich space in Black studies is coming up with new language. I do want to say too, part of why I haven't finished much of a project on Black conservatives, and it's been so long, is because it is so difficult to study something that's the exact opposite of who you are, and to do it with the care that as Black studies scholars we are trained to utilize in our research. And so it has been definitely a major stressor, and it's taken its toll. And so I don't know that I necessarily recommend it, but there's some of us who have to, take one for the team to do that work. And I say this because a lot of what many of these people have been espousing through their ideology is a distraction. And so part of what I've been struggling with is I can't take this seriously because you're not serious. People might start, even though I ended up reorienting my work towards a historical study instead of thinking about the contemporary conservatives, because they're not serious. They don't even believe half the things or the things that they're saying. They're following scripts. And so do I want to say something about Candace Owens? No, because she's a distraction. She's not serious, but somebody has to end up doing that work. And so I have fallen away from the work often, many times, and thinking about ways to better use my energy.
Yeah, I think the scripting of racial life in the U.S. that's a complication for us as scholars. I don't quite know how to deal with it, because as you said, it's not serious, but its effects are really serious.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so how do we think
a huge impact.
How do we think of pre-scripting as ideological and intellectual work that doesn't necessarily come from a deep ideology or a deep intellectual place? I don't know. That's a question. I don't know if I can take that. I don't know if I have the tools to take that on, but that is our contemporary life. But we need to know that the historical stuff, I think, has faded from view, that sort of critical engagement. So, and maybe, this next question, maybe you've already started to give a bit of an answer to it, but I'll ask it for, different kinds of ways you might think about it, which is, what do you think that the field of Black studies has done well over its past 5+ decades, but also what do you think it hasn't done particularly well?
Yeah, I think the scholarship itself has just been brilliant. Um, I don't know about other, if you would call it a field, um, can really compete with the vastness and richness of Black Studies scholarship thought of broadly in terms of the way that people have interrogated various aspects of Black life. It's been pretty amazing the past, 20 years even. So the scholarship, I think, is tremendous. I also think Black Studies has done very well in terms of expanding our understanding of race in ways that are more rigorous in terms of connecting it to and saying that it is always already connected to these other um, structures like capitalism, gender, sexuality, um, class. And so I think that has been a real benefit to broadly to scholarship in terms of how Black studies have deepened our understanding of race. Um, I think in terms of nurturing and supporting, I don't know, but I've been really lucky, I think, to have had so much support everywhere I've been at Northwestern, at Cornell, and UVA. Um, So, I don't know that in traditional disciplines, perhaps, and that is also related to our teaching. The way we teach and engage with our students is just different than what they experience in other disciplines. And so I think that's like we've given students so much light and we've trained students in other disciplines. These students are not majoring in African-American studies, even if they finish the major. It's like, okay, this is your fourth class. It's your third class you're taking with me. Why you're not a major? So their parent don't want them to major. They don't know how they're going to get a job. But they are learning and they are growing and they're becoming better people because of the experiences they have in Black studies. And I'm also really touched and floored by the number of emails I'll get from students from years ago who would end up, especially during the George Floyd moment, or even prior, like Black Lives Matter, people were just like, wow, I think about all the things we were talking about in our class in this moment. And I now been sharing it with my parents and my friends. And so I think the impact that we have on the personal development of students is unmatched, probably. I think one of the things that we don't do well is, I mentioned it, disagreement over ideology and strategy. A lot of times our disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that you become my enemy or that you should be vilified, or some people, I think, probably deserve that. But I don't find that we've disagreed well. And I've seen that in the departments that I've been into as well. At Cornell, it was so much of our the culture there is that you had these professors who stood on different sides of an argument, but they weren't in conflict or like Robert Harris. I worked with Robert Harris and James Turner, and they are different, although they do overlap. But it wasn't like I don't mess with you or I'm trying to take you down. And they engaged in a lot of vigorous debate. And all of them did, except for the person who was quiet. The person who was quiet ended up taking over leadership and totally destroyed that department. So much so that the way in which the person worked with leadership to depoliticize Africana, to take away this autonomy, is the reason why I can go on that campus and math and chemistry are holding their classes now in the Africana Center, or that all of a sudden the white students all of a sudden feel comfortable filling up the seats in the library. That Rachel Dolezal's book can be in the building. I almost put the book in the trash, but I figured the alarm was going to go off. But
That's a tough
what
choice
happens.
right there.
But I'm saying that we are so open though. So this evolution with Africana helped happen from the inside. It didn't happen from outside. And so even as someone, and I went to to toe to toe with this person, Salah Hassan. When he took over leadership, I was a student there, and I kept, telling him, like, "What are you doing? Why?" Like, even if you disagree with someone, you don't have to try to destroy them in some ways, And part of what I learned too in that moment is that people would try to buy you off, and it worked. Um, I was definitely Hassan tried to neutralize me because he saw I was older as a student. I had worked professionally before going to graduate school, so I was older. I had probably felt more audacious to even bring up, call a meeting with the faculty and say, you know what, this is something that we've been experiencing that we need to talk about, and I've done that. And so part of it, I remember like Hassan would when we invite people to speak, he will always send me to dinner. Always send me to dinner, regardless of what the topics were about. So I started sending to other students. So I would get the invitation. I would tell so and so, this person actually aligns with your work. You should go. The dinner is at this place. It start at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And he would get annoyed with me, but I'm like, don't try to buy me off. What are you doing? Why would you continue? Why would you point me out and try to give me all the spoils? So we go to New York. He'll say, you can stay in the hotel, but I can't do that for everybody else. Okay, well, we coming back to Ithaca because I'm not going to do that. And he did that with faculty, promising them certain things. And so these things happen in Black studies spaces, and it's no place to hold people accountable for how Black studies can be assaulted and the power of it innovated and then incorporated into the university structure in ways that what's the word? I was going to say neutered just because trash Zuckerberg said that about women have neutered the corporate space. But so I won't use that term. But you get what I'm saying. Like it's even more than a defanging, but that happened within Black studies. And so everywhere I've gone, I've seen conflict. And part of what it was framed to us is that the new Black studies has to be progressive. It has to be, it can't be old style Black nationalists. People have these assumptions they make about people who they claim to be or frame them as Black nationalists. And I've seen people who think of themselves as progressive, I suppose, just treat each other like shit, just terrible. It's like, how are you in Black studies and you treating other Black people like shit? Like, that should be unacceptable. There has to be an ethics and an ethos in the space that we're in. And if you want to act like that, and that's not just in Black studies, let me tell you, because then anthropology, oh my God, history departments, English, this is a problem in academia. But it should be different in Black studies. And while I definitely had tremendous support in nurturing every place I've gone, there's also been like toxic behavior and there's no space to talk openly about it or hold people accountable for it. And so I think we have to do better with that. Calling people out and saying, no, we're not having it.
I think that so much of, it's about a lot of things, but one of the elements of what you're talking about is what we call like professional or institutionalization of a field like Black studies, which was insurgent from its beginning and interruptive and disruptive from its beginning. And part of institutionalization is that kind of corporatization, right? And by corporate, I don't just mean, you have your own library, which strangely teaching chemistry classes, but not just you have your own library or nice offices, but also corporatization in terms of favors, right? That idea of like, well, your real problem couldn't possibly be ideological. It has to be you feel like you're not a part of the team. I'm going to make you feel a part of the team to sort of make this ideological question go away. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's true about academia in general, but I like that you're just like, we could be the field that does better on that. And what will be interesting is to see if that gets worse or better in the crisis to come, which is, where, will Black studies exist in 10 years, right? I think that's a real question, in institutions. Black studies as you're, reading announcements at the school, right? Studying in a Saturday, school or after school. That's a different question. But the the campus presence of Black Studies is going to be in crisis, and will that make things worse or better around exactly what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing I just wanted to add too is that when I was in graduate school at Cornell, we actually organized a meeting of graduate students in all the PhD programs. This was led by Jonathan Fenderson. Ronald Williams was a part of that effort. We all met at the Schomburg, and we thought that we would encourage each other to maintain a commitment to the original mission of Black Studies, because that mission is still relevant to us today. So we could say it's about the origin, but here we are still fighting for the basic stuff that we thought that we had secured long ago. And so we can never be satisfied or comfortable in these spaces. There's always been ongoing assaults. And so we had that meeting at the Schomburg, and that was really important for the graduate students to do that, to say we need to link up and create a network with folks who are getting PhDs in Black Studies, and make sure that we remain committed to that mission. When I was a graduate student at Northwestern, we had an opportunity to have a graduate conference and got funding for it, and ultimately had the inaugural meeting of, at the time, the 7 PhD programs of African-American Studies. I pretty much led the organization around that. And what bothers me now is that it was the inaugural and last meeting. And so even as people, it's funny because some people tap you on the shoulder like, you should have done this and you should have invited this person to speak, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, you know what? You could do it in 2 years. In 2 years, I want to see you do it your way. Let's do it. And that didn't happen again, as far as I know. And so that part, I think we haven't done well in terms of linking up to have the debates, to have the conversations, to further our mission for our discipline. And so that's been a missing piece, because in a moment like Black Lives Matter, I was looking around like, Black Studies should be, we should have an answer right now in terms of how we are going to contribute or be relevant to political education in this moment. And so it was a moment that was lost. I mean, individually, Black Studies professors are publishing and, popular media and are actually on the front line. So there were people involved, but in terms of our departments and thinking about a network, like we have a large network now, a critical mass of folks doing Black Studies. Mm-hmm. How are we relevant to this moment? And so I think we haven't done well in terms of maintaining a true connection and building with each other.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a bitter thing to take on, because in this moment of crisis, we don't have friends and allies outside of Black Studies. I mean, maybe a little bit here and there, but they try to close the Black Studies or African-American Africana Studies at University of Maryland. I don't think the history department refuses to go to work to protest, right? But where do we have allies? Where do we have that sense of organization? In a time of crisis, it becomes not just a kind of moral question. It becomes practical in terms of paychecks and offices and classes and all of that. So the direness of that and the urgency of it, I'm really glad to hear you bring it up front and center and just say when are we going to address this? As you say, the first and last. That's terrible. I wish we had a PhD program, because I love that idea. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should do that. Maybe a University of Maryland's undergraduate only department should host the PhD programs and.
And I feel like, maybe it's always a question of finances, because, Northwestern was being celebrated. Black Studies was in vogue. The president wanted to associate himself with it. So it was a specific moment where we were able to, get you some real good food for the catering and the dinner. Like we tried to spoil us in that moment. So I get that people don't have those kind of budgets. It was but there are creative ways, like if graduate students can pull each other together and say, we're going to meet at the Schomburg next Saturday, we can pull our resources together to meet wherever, in a bookstore, library, 100%. That's how I'm feeling about it. Yeah.
So let me ask you a last question, and maybe that's your answer, but might as well ask it as a sort of final query. What what is the issue that you think we should all be thinking about, or what is the question you would want us all to be asking?
Hmm. I think it's hard to think about just one, but I
I
think,
don't think anybody said just
finally
one. It's usually two, three, four, five.
okay, I think that finally, like, the question that we should be asking, I think just broadly speaking in the issue is, how is our research relevant to the liberation of Black people? How is our research relevant to social transformation? And I think that's if we lose sight of that, then we lose Black studies.
Mm,
At least in the academy, I think it will look different ways in communities. But we need to be connected to communities, Black communities. Even with the question of like, will Black studies even exist, or is ultimately there are going to be fights. We've always been fighting, so that's actually not anything new. Is put before us. Like, people who are chairs of these departments have always had to struggle and fight.
mhm.
There are always attempts at some point to disband or um, cut the budgets and all kinds of things with Black studies. So the space in the academy has always been precarious. But um, we if part of what sustains Black studies are the students, and somehow we don't have that connection any. So are the students going to protest to say, "Oh, don't you dare touch Black studies," you know? If they are career oriented, and even though they're taking our classes, if they're not going to put it on the line in terms of actually protesting or showing the university that they won't stand for it, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And you need allies in Black communities to fight. I mean, that's even how Black studies was established in the first place, because they had people in local communities. When I was in court in Ithaca, I was really just so saddened by some community folks who explained to me that they don't feel comfortable going in that building anymore, a building that they helped to establish, a space that they helped to establish, that they didn't feel welcome there anymore. And so I think that we have to be relevant outside of the ivory tower. And part of that to me is not even, a lot of times I see that people frame it as like that's a imperative from Black power. But, I think about the freedom schools, and even with teaching and studying Mississippi Freedom Summer, Charles Cobb said that, our charge with the freedom schools is radical questioning. It's what we do really well in Black studies, is relevant education, and is challenging the myths of society.
Mm.
And so that's been my goalpost. And I think that can continue to further our mission of being related, or relevant, I'm sorry, to Black freedom and Black liberation.
I love that. It's a wonderful place to end. Thank you. And it's a reminder of things that aren't just moral imperatives, but are also practical about the future, and also out of respect for the trajectory of the field, its origin points, its seeds. So I love the way throughout this conversation, but really crystallized it there at the end. You've really layered all of those things so nicely. And just a sort of podcast note, a graduate student in English, Brielle Gorel, is going to be starting a series of podcasts for this Black Studies podcast, talking with leaders of Black student unions across the country around exactly these kinds of questions. Because
That's awesome.
Ashley and I were talking about, one of the things that's missing. It's in the questions. Students demands founded the field, but we're not talking to students. We're talking to graduate students, but not undergrads. And then I was like, professor, that's kind of a hard person to talk to. Maybe the graduate student will be an in between there. But Brielle's really brilliant and super committed to Black studies. So I think
Awesome. That's great to hear.
and I think getting that moment into the podcast, but also, as you were just saying, as a reminder to all of us as a department, it's a responsibility, and it's a responsibility that I don't think we do very well broadly. And that's a tough question, but it's like all these questions you've raised, absolutely have to be asked and faced. So thank you so much. I was really looking forward to this, and hear your thoughts. This has been absolutely brilliant. So
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.